All right, I'm very excited to have this next speaker. It's his first time speaking at our conference, and the first time we've had a former SEC chairman speak at the conference. It's even more appropriate this year with all of the SEC proposed amendments regarding 13D rules and swaps disclosure and ESG. Jay Clayton was formerly a corporate law partner at Sullivan Cromwell and a member of its managing committee. From 2017 through 2020, he served as chairman of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. He was also an active member of the Financial Stability Board, International Organization of Securities Commissions, Financial Stability Oversight Council, and the President's Working Group on Financial Markets. Since resigning as chairman of the SEC, Jay has been named Senior Policy Advisor and of Counsel at Sullivan Cromwell, Lead Independent Director of Apollo Global Management, and Adjunct Professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and Director of American Express. Just when he thought things could not get any better for him, he gets an invitation to speak at the 13D Monitor Active Passive Investor Summit. Please welcome Jay Clayton. Okay, take that seat. Yeah.
Well,
So great to have you, Jay.
nice to see you.
Let's just get right into it with the 13D rules.
Okay.
And I'll just describe them a little bit for the audience if they don't know. The first rule I want to talk about is the swap disclosure. The SEC has proposed an amendment that cash-settled swaps need to be treated as beneficial ownership for 13D purposes and count towards the 5%. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, let's back up just a little bit. I came in the beginning of the conference, had a great investment idea, and I turned to one of my friends here and I said, this is the only market in the world where you have people invest this amount of rigor in companies from the outside and really put what I would say the pressure of good ideas on management. And that's a really good thing, okay? It's the only place, because it's the only place where if you have a really good idea and you have some capital, you can actually affect change. So, we are tinkering with that system. Now, every system over time, because of innovation, technology, one of the innovations is swaps, that has come to us, needs a refresher. If you add up everything that's happening, including what I would say is almost real-time disclosure of swap positions, it's kind of a sea change in a system that has some issues, but is certainly not broken. I mean, you have to benchmark things. If you compare this system to the shareholder engagement system anywhere else, it works better. Mm-hmm. So, what do I think? Do I think there have been things that you can use the term abuse in the cash-settled swaps area, where you actually are exerting influence over directors, management, doing the kinds of things that the market ought to know about? Yes, I think that has happened. Do I think that we should go through sort of a sea change in all of the rules? No, and I heard somebody speculate, is all of what's proposed going to happen? I don't think so. The question is, where can we move it where we're clearly making an improvement without, too much deleterious effect?
And actually, and by the way, we're going to save some time at the end for questions from the audience for Jay, so start thinking of those now. I'm going to just segue from the 13D rules and get back to them in a second to get to 10B1, because we're talking about swaps.
And I'm happy to answer your specific, but it has to be answered in that context.
Yeah, no, I get it. And forget about the 13D rule for a second. There's another proposal by the SEC, Rule 10B1, that basically says any investor that buys $300 million of swaps or $150 million of swaps, any security-based swaps, and has 150 of common stock, has to disclose that publicly the next day.
So, one of the things in regulation that really has to make sense for you to do it is asymmetry. Mm-hmm. And why would you have a next day disclosure for a synthetic position where you don't have a next day disclosure for a cash position? And there better be a good reason. Mm-hmm. And I'll just say from my own perspective, at a $300 million threshold, which is not a percentage threshold, it's not a trading volume threshold, it's not a systemically risky threshold, I don't see why, it's hard for me to see why that makes sense. I'm happy to listen to arguments, but I haven't seen an argument other than that's a good number. Let's try it. Mm-hmm. Again, this system is so, what I would say is so built on its history. Large changes like that, I am skeptical of.
Let's talk about back to the 13D rules. The other rule that's been, I think, quite controversial that seems to be a little bit out there is changing the definition of the group to effectively, if Jay Clayton is filing a 13D next week and me and you are talking about that company and I buy the stock, I'm automatically a member of a group with you. Or my company is, or if somebody in my company owns it, we're all a member of a group, and really doesn't give anybody an idea if they're a group or not. How do you feel about that?
Look, I think we just heard that people do not like the idea that I'm building a position, I call you and I tell you this is my good idea, I've had some good ideas in the past, let's assume that that's the case, and you kind of support that idea, and that is somehow not a group. Mm-hmm. You can see where people don't like that. It feels wrong. That said, and I think this is kind of the regulatory conundrum we're in, there are all sorts of current issues where people want to garner shareholder support. And the SEC is actually encouraging those. So it's very difficult to write a regulation that says, for what I would call is return-oriented investing, we're going to have a very tight, rigorous definition of what a group is. But for other forms of investing, the ability to share ideas and coordinate is going to be somewhat unfettered. Mm-hmm. That's actually a very difficult system to administer. So if I call you and I say, Ken, look, these guys, they have the laziest balance sheet in the world. I'm going to, spruce it up. No doubt everybody's going to pile in. And you say, you know what, I looked at it. You're right. I should take a position. And that's a group. Okay. But then I call you up and I say, you know what, that board of directors, they're really not the kind of board of directors that a company should have. I'm going to establish a position. I'm going to push them. Maybe you should join me in that. How do you distinguish between those two from a regulatory perspective? It's not easy. And, where do you divide the line? I know there are people in their minds that think that those are two very different things. I'm not so sure.
Right, and obviously the rules aren't in effect yet, but had they been in effect, had Jeff Smith filed a 13D next week on Salesforce, we could all be a group right here, right? And for 13D purposes, which would be interesting.
And look, you should always go back to fundamentals. It is a country where freedom of speech and freedom of opinion matter, right? And there are a lot of aspects of our industry that rely on that as part of what I would say is the check on regulation, including rating agencies and the like.
I'm going to skip over the third part of the 13D changes because I don't think the 10 days to 5 days, I think is somewhat meaningless. Let's move on to a universal ballot. Is that a couple of questions, and you can take these however you want. First of all, do you see that as a game changer? What do you see the consequence of that? And secondly, I know you were very busy with COVID and Brexit and cybersecurity, a lot of great things you did. This has been people have been talking about this for years. Is it something that came up when you were?
It was there, and look, I'm sympathetic to it in concept. Mm-hmm. Here's my worry, is that the cost of throwing board membership into question has now gone down dramatically. Now, we heard the prior panel, they did a nice job outlining how you use bylaws and the like to have checks on that cost. But let's be clear, the cost of putting board dynamics, board membership and composition into question has gone down dramatically as part of these changes. And I think you have to look at it in that way. I agree with the prior panel. Are we going to have a sea change in sort of director elections? Probably not. But at some companies, there is going to be pressure because it's much cheaper to bring to bear pressure. And it's much cheaper to bring to bear pressure, not just for economic reasons, but for other reasons. And I don't think anybody can take the other side of it. And this is a very interesting point, because it's cheaper to bring to bear pressure, but that does put costs on long investors, because they're going to have more situations to review, and that is something to think about.
You wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, I think it was in March, where you talked about the SEC's jurisdiction over ESG, so to speak. And you said, I mean, I don't want to put words in my mouth, but you kind of said they were maybe overstepping their boundaries. And then
No, I think that's what I said.
And then a couple of months later, the Supreme Court ruled in West Virginia versus the EPA that the EPA, in a real analogous case, was overstepping their boundaries. Talk about that. What kind of jurisdiction should the SEC have over ESG at companies?
Let's just go to what kind of jurisdiction should the SEC have over setting environmental transition policy. Okay? Because the proposal that is on the table takes the SEC reporting framework and establishes a parallel framework. It's not a financial reporting framework. It's a climate reporting, it's a GHG reporting framework that is based on our traditional financial reporting framework. And it selects the metrics and imposes liability and review in the same way as financial reporting for forward-looking information about an environmental transition. That's what people ask for. That's what it does. I don't think that is within the SEC's jurisdiction. Now, there's lots of lawyers who will say Jay's crazy. This is really just about providing information, and the SEC has broad authority to provide information. That can't be true, okay? You have to have some limiting principle on the disclosure obligations that you place on companies. And I think what the Supreme Court was coming out and saying is, wait a second, if the SEC can regulate, it can propose any kind of disclosure, or some other agency can require any type of disclosure or activity, what's left for the legislature to do? You know, and I will say that I think what has happened in the last 20 years, particularly around touchy issues like environmental, political spending, is our members of Congress have punted. They have ducked these very hard issues, and they've said, you know what, SEC, you do it. I mean, are you kidding? Wonderful people at the SEC. I love them dearly. They do a great job. They're not the people to engineer carbon transition in America. It's kind of that simple.
Talking about solving America's problems, one more question, and then I'll take some questions from the audience. Whether it's economic problems, climate problems, there's big problems in the country and the world. How do you think about solving those problems vis-a-vis the private sector and the public sector, and who's going to really solve those problems? So
look, that's a terrific question, and it's actually a source of frustration given the supply side issues that we faced right now. So we have supply side issues clearly in energy, not in this country, but globally in agriculture. We have a supply chain that is being reconfigured. It's not totally domesticized. These are things that America's great companies and other global companies spend thousands and thousands of hours and human capital figuring out. We ought to be tapping into that. It is not a failure of government to engage with the private sector on how to solve problems. You know, so for example, if we are going to commit to carbon transition, what is our model for carbon transition? Is LNG the transition fuel? If it is, Should we, the United States, be controlling the swing supply of LNG, or should we let somebody else do it? If you're going through a transition, I think you sure want to control the avenue of transition, and this is something that people should engage in. If I showed up in the boardroom and I said, you know what, I got a great idea, we're going to transition to carbon neutrality, but I didn't say how or how much money it was going to cost or how we were going to benchmark, you'd throw me out. But yet that seems to be what we're doing as a country.
And we end up maybe building a half bridge halfway there,
Yeah.
in a sense. All right, I'm going to open it up for questions to the audience right now. Yeah. Oh, someone's coming with the microphone.
Hi there. You mentioned that it's not the role of the SEC to provide the GHG reporting framework. What's the harm in them doing that? And if not them, then whose role should it be?
What's the harm in the SEC doing it?
The question was, what's the harm in the SEC asking for these GHG emissions, and if they're not doing it, who should do it?
So let me go back to who remembers conflict minerals, resource extraction? How'd that work out? Right? Actually, it's worse because you had a patchwork response to a global issue. So that's one here. The other thing is the metrics that have been selected have very little tie to financial performance, which is what they're trying to. So if you're a property and there's probably a property and casualty company in the room here. Your environmental risk, you have metrics that you're following, sea level rise, claims, all sorts of things that relate to climate. Your own GHG emissions is not one of them. But yet, somehow we're telling people that comparing companies across the board using GHG emissions is going to elicit meaningful investment information. I doubt it. But we kind of picked that metric as a speculation of a way to sort of go down this road. I think these are all my own opinions. I get to do this now. I think that that's a pretty costly speculation when we all know if we want to do this, a carbon tax is the way to go. So we have a deeply, deeply second best approach that is speculative, patchwork. So what's the harm? A lot of money to maybe get something? I don't know. Doesn't seem like that to me.
And the carbon tax would have to be done through Congress.
Carbon tax would have, but there's not an economist or a financial professional or a policy professional that doesn't say if you really want to transition, you would have an escalating carbon tax where you give people the time to allocate capital for what the future market looks like. Not.
Any other questions for Jay? Well, okay, back there.
Jay, what's your status on shorts? Is the SEC ever going to do anything on disclosure?
So look, my view, and it's been that way for a while, is I think individual short sale disclosure will have a chilling effect in the marketplace. I do think that we have the technology to have almost real-time aggregate short sale disclosure. I think better access to the total short interest in the market is a good place to start.
I thought I saw another hand up. Was there back there?
Thank you. As distinct from GHG emissions, do you think that mandating climate risks reporting is within the SEC's jurisdiction, or do you think that's also a major question?
No, here look, if I ran the zoo, which I don't anymore, I think a very responsible way to do this, which would be defensible in court and actually provide the people in this room with valuable information, would be for the SEC to say, there seems to be general public consensus that we should transition to carbon neutrality by 2050 or in some period. Please describe for your investors the actions that you're taking and what developments needs to take place over that time period for your company to perform well. That would be, so you're an airline. You're like, you know what? If we don't have either a substantial change in the technology for airlines whether we would have electrification, we're going to need a carbon trading market in order to comply with that kind of rule. And, these are the things that we're doing to get there by 2050. Agricultural companies would have the same thing. Construction companies, cement, agriculture are almost as big as the fossil fuel industry in terms of carbon emissions. We would then have what I would say is firm-specific, rigorous information, and we could sort of plan a lot better than trying to benchmark across GHG information. And maybe with that, industry-specific metrics will emerge, and people will start gravitating toward those. But I doubt there'll be GHG emissions as the industry-specific illuminating information to get to carbon neutrality 2050.
Anyone else? Questions?
Boy, they asked a lot more questions when I was in charge.
Exactly. Let me ask you a question about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996 that basically is being used to give platforms like Facebook and Twitter impunity from liability for posts of users. That looks like it's going to be revisited by the Supreme Court this year. What are your thoughts on that?
I think we started, and I said, you have an ecosystem that's developed over time. Clearly, our ecosystem in corporate control could use some sprucing up, but it's pretty good. Same thing here. I mean, if I said to you a platform is without your consent, taking all of your activity and curating content, and truly curating content,
yep.
like ordering it, presenting it to you in a way, and handing it to you, I think you'd say that's publishing. I think most people in America would feel that that's publishing. So, whether it's a legislative action, whether it's at the Supreme Court, I think there will be areas of platform activity that become defined as publishing.
Yeah, and I would add that this law was 1996, and there was no such thing as social media in 1996. I think it traces to maybe 1997. Facebook was 2004, YouTube 2005, Twitter 2006. This is 8 years after this law. So I think it was meant to protect mainly ISPs.
Look, it's terrific, right?
World.
I mean, these platforms are terrific. I get my news from Twitter.
Yeah.
It's one of the sources. It's amazing. But if somebody's targeting me with what I would say is curated content to influence my opinion, that's a little different from providing an open forum.
Right. Let me end it. We have a minute left. Let me end it with this. You've been obviously in the room with the SEC, the Commission. Do you have a prediction on these 13D rules or the 10B1 rule, how that might play out? I would note that the 10B1 rule was, and I don't know if this is meaningful or not, you could tell me, the 10B1 rule was approved by the Commission 3-2, and the 13D rules were approved 3-1. Is that meaningful? Does that mean that 10B1 is less likely to be approved after the comment period? How do you think those are going to play out, if you have any prediction?
I do predict that the staff will take the comments on board. I think the asymmetry of treatment of a cash versus a synthetic position in a market where people move from cash to synthetics on a regular basis, they'll get that.
Yeah.
And I think they'll do something about it. Where exactly it lands, I don't think my guess is a whole lot better than people in this room. But I will say, the comment process, engaging and rigorously engaging, and I'll just say this, not being afraid to say that you think something is wrong is a really, really important part of our regulatory landscape. I mean, there were things that I thought I knew. We put them out there, and people said, you know what, Jay, you're wrong about that, and we changed it. And so take the time, invest the energy to comment and be direct. If it's gonna mess up the marketplace, say it.
Great. Thank you so much, Jay.